It was a little after 8 when Maigret came into the kitchen, still wearing his house slippers. The sky outside the window was a flat grey, the kind that promised no rain. Just its memory, and perhaps more of it later. Madame Maigret had laid out a small breakfast on the oilcloth-covered table, 2 slices of bread slightly over-toasted, a pat of butter, and a pot of coffee already beginning to cool. "You should take your coat," she said without looking up from the sink. "It's wetter than it looks." Maigret nodded, though he didn't fetch the coat. He sat instead and buttered his bread slowly, the corner of his thumb catching in a worn groove on the handle of the butter knife. The radio murmured low in the next room. Something about traffic on the boulevard. Housemen, our neighbors. Dog barked once, distantly, then fell quiet again. He chewed methodically, watching the steam rise from his cup. The quiet was a kind he liked, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the water in the pipes, his wife's presence. For a long moment he didn't think of anything at all. And then, inevitably, he thought about work. He wasn't due at the Quai des Favors this morning. There was no pressing case. Nothing urgent in his drawer except a report half-written, and a few phone calls that could wait. But still, there was that itch, the one that came when the weather turned like this, and the city smelled of damp stone and bread crusts. He heard it then, not at first as sound so much as an impression. The telephone in the hallway ringing with a kind of restraint, as if reluctant to interrupt. 3 rings, then a pause, then 3 again. Madame Maigret turned off the tap and wiped her hands. "Shall I?" "No," said Maigret, standing. "It's for me." He moved slowly, like a man walking into a room he already knew too well. He picked up the receiver and offered his name in a low voice. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, crisp with formality. "Chief Inspector, sorry to trouble you. It's about a man. Well, he was found this morning, Rue des Recollets, an old boarding house. Nothing violent, at least not obviously. But the woman who owns the place, she says he came to her last night, asked for a room, paid in cash, and whispered his name. Then nothing. This morning he's dead, sitting upright in the chair." Maigret said nothing for a moment. He could hear the man's breathing, steady, patient. "What name did he give?" The voice hesitated. "That's the thing. He whispered it so softly, she says. She almost didn't catch it, but she swears it was his own, as if he wasn't telling her, just reminding himself." A click sounded in the line. A second. Receiver picked up, then replaced. Probably a shared line in some dusty office. "I'll come," Maigret said. He hung up and stood for a moment with his hand still on the receiver. In the kitchen, Madame Maigret poured the rest of the coffee into a small thermos without asking. "You'll be home for lunch?" she asked. "I don't know." "Take the coat," she said again, softly. Maigret took it. Outside, the rain had already begun again. Not enough to matter, just enough to change the color of the stone and darken the wool of his trousers. He lit a pipe and walked toward the Rue des Recollets. The morning felt long already, like something half-remembered from a forgotten dream. The man had whispered his own name. Maigret didn't yet know why that mattered. but he felt it did. The Rue des Récollets was narrow and damp, a street caught halfway between two worlds, the quiet residential blocks to the north, and the louder, more crowded arteries of Paris to the south. It was the kind of place you could walk through on any given day and never quite remember. The old brick buildings were as ordinary as a street could be, their windows always slightly ajar, offering glimpses of faded curtains or the occasional silhouette of someone sitting at a table, their life half-formed and uninterested in anything more than the mundane flow of ours. Maigret took his time as he walked, letting the rhythm of his steps match the pulse of the rain. The air had a heavy smell of wet asphalt, damp bread from the bakery around the corner, and something else, something hard to pin down, like the lingering breath of a long-forgotten conversation. He didn't hurry. He wasn't expecting anything. Grand dot at the end of the street. A boarding house stood, its facade sagging with age and neglect. The windows above were dark, but the door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for him. A brass nameplate, tarnished by time, identified it as La Maison du Marais. No name appeared on the doorbell, no indication of any welcome, but Maigret knew these places well enough, the kind of quiet, unremarkable buildings that never had much business but always held onto their secrets. He entered slowly, not with urgency, but with the same patience that had served him all these years. Inside, the hall was dim, its air musty with the scent of old wood and stale carpet. The lighting was soft, almost apologetic. A few empty chairs sat against the walls. A small table cluttered with forgotten magazines and a bowl of dried flowers. An old woman, presumably the owner, stood at the desk. She didn't look up when Maigret entered, her hands resting on the counter in front of her. She was thin, her back hunched from years of standing over the same desk, and her face was marked with the fine lines of a life spent in quiet solitude. The kind of person who never really noticed the passage of time, because it had stopped mattering long ago. Maigret spoke first, his voice low but clear. "Madam, I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. I understand there's been an incident." The woman's hands twitched, but she didn't look up. Her voice was hoarse, as though she had been speaking too much already. "Yes, in room 12. She pointed down the hallway toward a door at the end, where faint light shone through the cracks. I didn't know what to think at first. He was so polite. And then, when he left, he didn't look right." Maigret nodded, his eyes moving across the room, taking in the mundane details, the scuffed floorboards, the cracked mirror behind the desk, the faded clock on the wall. All of it seemed familiar in its ordinariness. "I see. And you didn't notice anything unusual?" Maigret asked, though he already knew the answer. It was always the same with people like her. There was never anything unusual until it was too late. "No," she said quickly, then hesitated, only the name. Maigret raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting her continue in her own time. "The man," she said slowly, her voice dropping as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "He whispered his name when he paid me. I didn't catch it all, but it was strange. He said it like it was his last words, as if he were already gone before I even saw him. Maigret didn't react. He simply nodded and walked toward the door at the end of the hall. It was always the smallest things that mattered. Things you couldn't see unless you were paying attention. Room 12 was no different from any other boarding house room. Small, cluttered, and simple. The kind of place you could rent for a week, a month, or even a year without ever truly being noticed. The window was half open, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. On the small desk near the bed, a lamp was still on, its light dim and flickering slightly, as if it had been left on too long. The man sat in the chair near the desk, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, like someone waiting for something or someone. He had been a tall man, not young, but not old either, perhaps in his late 40s. His clothes were ordinary, a dark suit, slightly frayed at the cuffs, a tie that had been knotted too tightly. He wasn't someone who stood out in a crowd, the kind of person who could disappear into a city like Paris without leaving a trace. Maigret stood quietly by the door, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't move for a long moment. The man's body, while still, seemed to hold a peculiar kind of tension, as if he were waiting for something that would never come. His face was pale, his features sharp, and there was an odd stillness to the way his eyes stared straight ahead, as though they had never really looked at anything at all. No one had noticed anything unusual about him, not really. No one had seen him before, at least not in any meaningful way. The landlady had told Maigret that he hadn't even asked for a specific room, just whatever was available. He had come in with a briefcase, a plain leather one that now sat open on the floor beside him, its contents still intact but untouched. Maigret crossed the room slowly, his shoes making no sound on the worn carpet. He crouched down beside the man and, without touching him, peered into the briefcase. There was nothing unusual inside. Some papers, an empty envelope, a small black notebook. But Maigret noticed something else, something that hadn't been mentioned. A single sheet of paper lay near the bottom, slightly crumpled, with a single word scrawled across it in dark ink. Maigret stood up, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't sure yet why it mattered, but it did, and that was enough for now. The afternoon had shifted into evening, and the rain continued its soft, unrelenting fall. It didn't matter much to Maigret. The weather was as much a part of Paris as the stone buildings and the narrow, winding streets. It was, in a way, comforting, and as he stepped out of the boarding house, the damp air settled over him like a second skin. His coat, now heavy with water, clung to his shoulders, but his mind was elsewhere, in the room, with the man, with the cryptic word on the paper. He had spent the last few hours reviewing the scene, talking to the landlady and the other residents, but no one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard a thing. No one had noticed the stranger until the moment he had left. He had paid his rent for the week with exact change, his face expressionless, his eyes carefully averted. There had been no sign of struggle, no visible wounds, nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary. The only clue, the only thing that might mean something, was that single sheet of paper, that word, the one that Maigret could not get out of his head. Whispered, the landlady had said. He whispered his name, and the word on the paper. It was simple. Maigret. But why? The question gnawed at him. His instinct was telling him something was wrong. That this wasn't a simple case of a man who had died alone, a casualty of his own time and place. No, there was something more, something hidden in plain sight. Maigret walked through the wet streets, his feet moving automatically. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, but he found himself drawn to the nearest cafe. The Café des Deux Maggots was just a few blocks away, and its warm, dry interior offered a moment of solace. He slipped inside, brushing his coat against the doorframe. The noise of conversation and the clink of glasses filled the air, but Maigret ignored it all. He headed toward his usual corner dot as he sat down. The waiter, a familiar face, nodded silently and brought him his drink, a glass of wine, red, full-bodied, just how he liked it. Maigret took a sip, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. He let the quiet of the cafe envelop him. Closing his eyes for a moment, the case wasn't something that could be solved by a single burst of inspiration. It wasn't like that. He had learned long ago that true answers came not from sudden epiphanies, but from patience, from listening, from waiting. The wind howled outside, but inside, Maigret was as still as the glass before him. His mind drifted back to the boarding house, to the man's body, to the word on the paper, and to the strange way the landlady had spoken of him. The man's name had been whispered like a confession, a secret buried too deeply to be heard by anyone, except for those who listened closely enough. Maigret found himself staring at the condensation forming on his glass, the droplets tracing lines down its side. He thought of the rain. It always made him feel more connected to people. The rain washed away the pretenses, the armor everyone wore. It stripped things down to the bare essentials. People were more honest when it rained. He drained his glass. And then the thought struck him. Why would a man whisper his name? The question haunted him, and the answer eluded him. It was something Maigret knew he had to explore, but not yet. Not now. The first rule was always to wait, to observe, to gather as much information as possible before acting. He wasn't ready yet to confront that question, not until he had learned more about the man, about his life, his habits, his connections. The rain, once a constant companion, had turned into a steady patter now. It made Maigret feel as if the world outside had slowed, its rhythm measured by the raindrops falling in time with his thoughts. A familiar voice interrupted his reverie. It was Whodunit, one of his colleagues, who had appeared unbidden at Maigret's table, his round face slightly flushed from the cold. Whodunit wasn't much of a detective in Maigret's eyes, but he was always around. He had a habit of turning up just when you didn't need him. Maigret, Whodunit said in his usual, cheerful tone, "Thought I might find you here. I'm following up on that case at the boarding house. They've been talking about it at the station." Maigret didn't look up at first, though he could hear the eagerness in Whodunit's voice. Maigret had always found Whodunit's enthusiasm to be more of a hindrance than a help. But he allowed the man to continue. There was no reason not to. "What do they say?" Maigret asked, finally looking up. "They're saying it's just a simple case of a man dying alone in his room. No one noticed anything strange. Some of the other residents didn't even realize he was gone until the landlady called for help." Lognon paused, glancing around the cafe before sitting down uninvited. "But I don't know. Something feels off, don't you think?" Maigret's gaze returned to the window, where the rain continued to fall in rhythmic, steady streams. He didn't answer immediately. There was a truth to what Lognon had said. There was nothing overtly strange about the death, but the entire situation had an air of uncertainty, as though something had been left unspoken. "Yes," Maigret said, finally, his voice quiet. "Something is off." Lognon leaned forward, eager for more. "You think it's murder? Could it be someone in the building?" Maigret didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at Lognon for the first time since the man had arrived. His eyes were calm, unreadable. "Perhaps," he said, "but not in the way you think." Lognon frowned, clearly unsure of what that meant. But Maigret wasn't about to explain it to him. Not yet. "So, where does that leave us?" Lognon asked, now sounding more interested than ever. "It leaves us where we started," Maigret replied, rising from the table. He paid for his drink, then turned toward the door. "We wait, Lognon. We wait for the right moment." With that, Maigret stepped back into the rain. The street now darker than before. The world felt quieter now, the noise of the cafe fading behind him as he headed back to the boarding house. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't going to let him go until he figured out why. The rain had slowed by the time Maigret returned to the boarding house, but the damp streets still glistened. Under the faint light of the street lamps, his coat clung to his back, heavy, with the weight of water and thoughts. He had told Lognon that they were still waiting, but Maigret knew better than to believe his own words. Something was off, and every instinct he had told him that the answers wouldn't be found in the usual way. He entered the boarding house once more, the dim light inside doing little to chase away the dreariness of the day. The landlady was sitting behind the counter, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes tired, as though she had been expecting him. She didn't greet him. There was no need. They had been through the motions earlier, and she had told him everything she knew, or at least everything she thought she knew. The question now was whether she knew more than she was willing to admit. Maigret stepped into the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards under his boots the only sound. He was aware of the silence around him, the thick air hanging in the building. It was the kind of silence that hinted at things left unsaid, of lives quietly passing by in rooms that had seen too many years. The building, old and worn, seemed to breathe with the stories of those who had stayed here. He paused outside the room where the man had died. The door was closed, and the scene inside had already been cleared. But Maigret had an odd feeling about the room. It had been too neat, too clean for someone who had just passed away, even if it had been a quiet death in the middle of the night. The door opened easily when Maigret tried the handle. Inside, the room was untouched, almost sterile. The single bed, the small dresser, The worn armchair by the window, everything was arranged with a kind of clinical order. But it was the small details that caught Maigret's attention. The way the curtains were drawn to tightly, as if the man had been trying to shut out something more than the rain. The faint smell of old tobacco lingering in the air. The untouched glass of water by the bedside table. It wasn't much, but for Maigret, it was everything. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the atmosphere of the room. He wasn't looking for physical evidence. He knew that was not the way forward. What he needed was to understand this man. Who had he been? What had led him to die alone in this cold, quiet room? He turned away from the bed, his eyes scanning the room once more, before his gaze fell on a small piece of paper on the floor. It was just barely visible, caught under the edge of the dresser. Maigret crouched down, his fingers brushing against the paper as he retrieved it. He unfolded it slowly, his fingers hesitating for a moment before he read the words printed on it. It wasn't a name this time, but an address, a simple one. 9 Rue de la Paix. Maigret's brow furrowed. The address meant nothing to him, but it felt significant. The paper had been left here deliberately, tucked out of sight, almost as if it had been dropped by accident. But Maigret had learned long ago that nothing was truly accidental. Everything had its purpose. With the paper still in hand, Maigret left the room and made his way down the stairs to the landlady's office. She was still behind the counter, her eyes flicking up briefly when she saw him. But this time, Maigret didn't bother with pleasantries. "Do you know where this is?" he asked, placing the piece of paper in front of her. He spoke quietly, but there was an edge to his voice, a slight sharpness that made the landlady look up in surprise. She glanced at the paper, her fingers momentarily hovering over it. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Yes, it's a street in the more upscale part of the city," she said slowly, as if uncertain of her own words. "I don't know anyone there, though. It's not the kind of place that would bring someone like him." "Someone like him," Maigret repeated, his voice low. "What do you mean?" The landlady shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know. He wasn't like the others. He kept to himself, didn't talk much. But there was something about him, something that didn't sit right." Maigret studied her carefully, watching for the slightest shift in her expression. It wasn't guilt he saw, not exactly, but something. In her eyes was different now. There was a hesitation, a reluctance to speak further. And that, Maigret knew, meant there was more. Was there anything unusual about him? Maigret asked, keeping his voice even. Casual. She shifted in her seat again, and Maigret noticed the way her gaze darted toward the door as though she were looking for an escape. But when she spoke, it was with a tremor of uncertainty. Sometimes he would sit by the window, looking out at the street. He never said much, but he always seemed, I don't know, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for something. Maigret's mind clicked into place. That was it. It was the feeling that had been nagging at him. The sense that this death wasn't just a random event. It was part of a larger story, one that was only beginning to take shape in his mind. Did he ever mention anyone at all? Maigret? Pressed. The landlady thought for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she tried to remember. Finally, she shook her head. No, he never spoke of anyone except for once. A name. He whispered it to himself. But it wasn't a name I recognized. I thought maybe he was just talking to himself. What was the name? Maigret asked quickly. Leaning forward, she hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. But then she spoke. Henry Lemoine. The name hung in the air like a shadow. Maigret nodded slowly, but his mind was already racing ahead. Henry Lemoine. He had heard the name before. But where? It tugged at the edges of his memory, just out of reach. He thanked the landlady and left, stepping back out into the rain-soaked streets. Henry Lemoine. That was where this would lead him. He was certain. It was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. The evening air was damp and still, and Maigret found himself walking slowly, his thoughts caught between the rain, the strange whisper of a name, and the vague sense that the case had shifted, that something significant had already been hidden from him. His steps echoed softly in the empty street, and as he reached the corner of the road, the familiar silhouette of his apartment building appeared in the mist. He didn't look up. His feet carried him instinctively, as they always did when he sought something steady. His wife, Louise, would be waiting for him, as she always was. He had no illusions that she was merely the doting spouse. Louise was sharp, perceptive, and in her quiet way, she knew him better than anyone. The thought of seeing her, her steady presence, gave him a kind of refuge from the gnawing uncertainty of the case. She was often the first to notice the smallest shifts in his mood, the subtlest changes in the rhythm of his thoughts. As he entered the apartment, he was immediately struck by the warmth that greeted him. The apartment smelled faintly of stew, something he had forgotten about, but his stomach grumbled in appreciation of the homey scent. The soft glow of the lamps illuminated the room, but it was the sight of Louise, sitting by the window with a book in her hands, that calmed his restlessness. She looked up when he entered, her face softening with the recognition of his tired gaze. "You're late," she said simply, as though it were an observation rather than an accusation. Maigret nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He took off his coat, the weight of the day's dampness suddenly more apparent now that he was inside. He dropped it on the armchair and walked toward her, taking a seat beside her, his presence a quiet disturbance in the otherwise peaceful room. "I had a feeling you were coming home late," Louise said after a moment, not looking up from her book. She had already noticed the change in his posture, the slight furrow in his brow. "What's bothering you?" "Nothing," Maigret said, his voice low. But there was an unmistakable flicker of truth in the way he avoided her eyes. Louise didn't press. Instead, she marked her page, set the book down, and turned to him, her gaze steady and calm. "I heard something strange today," she said. The words were careful, tentative, as though she, too, were measuring her response. "At the market, someone mentioned a name, Henry Lemoine." At that, Maigret stiffened imperceptibly, but his face remained neutral. He had thought about telling Louise, about bringing her into his thoughts, but he hadn't expected this. Henry Lemoine. It wasn't a name he had shared with anyone, certainly not with her. Yet here it was, spoken in her voice with the same quiet familiarity, as though it were a familiar part of his own investigation. "How do you know that name?" he asked, his tone guarded but not harsh. Louise shrugged lightly, her eyes bright with the unspoken curiosity that never seemed to waver. "A neighbor was talking about a man, someone who passed by their shop yesterday. He mentioned it as if it were common knowledge. I don't know. It was odd. It stuck with me." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressed together. He considered for a moment, then looked back at her. "That's interesting," he murmured. "It's the name of a man who has been on my mind. A name tied to the case I've been working on." Louise watched him carefully, her gaze perceptive in a way that felt both comforting and disconcerting. "It's funny, though," she said slowly. "I don't think I've ever heard you mention him before. It's not like you to leave details like that out." Maigret hesitated, then sighed. He took a long moment to consider how much to reveal. Louise wasn't just his wife. She was his mirror, and sometimes that was more disconcerting than helpful. But in this case, she might have already noticed what he had been too preoccupied to see himself. "It's nothing," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice this time. He reached for his coffee cup, already cold, and took a long sip. The warmth of the liquid only reminded him how much he had allowed his thoughts to drift into unfamiliar places. "I've been to the boarding house again," he added. "The one where the man died. Did you find anything?" Louise asked quietly. "There's something about that room," Maigret replied, his voice distant as he thought aloud. Everything was in order, neat, as if someone was trying to make it seem normal. But it wasn't. There's something strange about the way he lived. "And you think Henry Lemoyne has something to do with it?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Yes," Maigret said. "It's the name that keeps coming back. It doesn't feel like a coincidence." His gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the rain had returned, pattering softly against the panes. The world beyond the apartment seemed distant, as though it had nothing to do with him for the moment. Louise fell silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of his words settle. Then her voice broke through the quiet. "Do you think you'll find what you're looking for?" Maigret hesitated again. His gaze lifted to meet hers, and he saw in her eyes the unspoken worry, the quiet support she always offered when she knew something was troubling him. It was the kind of thing he didn't notice at first, the way her concern was hidden behind the surface of everyday things. But it was always there, waiting for him. "I don't know," Maigret admitted quietly, "but I'll have to find out." Louise placed her hand on his, a simple gesture, but it steadied him in a way that no case ever could. "You always do," she said softly, and Maigret, though exhausted, felt a brief moment of peace. The silence stretched between them again, comfortable. "Now," and Maigret leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a brief respite. It wasn't often he allowed himself such luxuries. The case would still be there in the morning, but for now, he could rest, if only for a few hours. And yet, as he sat there, something lingered, something he couldn't place. The name, Henry Lemoyne, a connection, something unspoken, that was beginning to coil tighter round his thoughts. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as the shadows deepened around them. In the quiet of the apartment, Maigret allowed himself to wonder whether the answers lay within the next conversation, or if they were waiting in the most unexpected places. The next day arrived with the same dull grayness that seemed to have settled over Paris in the past. Weak, the rain had not abated, and Maigret felt as though it had become a fixture of his life. He woke early, his mind already on the case, but it wasn't the usual clarity he'd felt in the past. Instead, there was a nagging sensation, a discomfort, that had crept into his thoughts, like a shadow that refused to leave. As he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his half-empty coffee cup, Louise moved around him with quiet efficiency. He had told her only a small fraction of what was on his mind, but she could tell that the weight of the case had settled heavily on his shoulders. Still, she didn't ask for more than he was willing to give. It was her way of observing, understanding, waiting for him to speak when he was ready. "Are you going out today?" Louise asked, her voice soft. "Yes," Maigret replied, his tone flat. He didn't say anything more, and Louise didn't press. She handed him a piece of bread and jam, but he only picked at it absently, his thoughts. Elsewhere, she had learned to recognize when he was this distant, when the case had consumed him so thoroughly that nothing else seemed to matter. It wasn't that he was unkind, but he became unreachable, as if the rest of the world had faded into the background. After finishing his coffee, Maigret stood, the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet echoing in the otherwise quiet room. He didn't even notice when Louise left the kitchen. It was the familiar rhythm of their mornings, the unspoken understanding that allowed them to move around each other, like ghosts in the same space. The rain had not let up, but it was no longer the thing on his mind. As he stepped out into the grey street, Maigret felt the familiar weight of his coat against his shoulders. The world around him seemed muffled, softened by the persistent downpour. The rhythm of the city had slowed, as if it, too, had succumbed to the melancholy that had taken root. He walked toward the station, where the quiet hum of Paris life continued unabated, people moving from place to place, unaware of the slow-burning mystery that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was in the stillness of their eyes, in the brief glances exchanged between strangers, in the unease that had begun to pervade the city's atmosphere, that Maigret arrived at the station and made his way to the familiar office, where he was met by Inspector Whodunit, whose ever-present gloom seemed to deepen with each passing day. Whodunit looked up from his desk as Maigret entered, his tired eyes not hiding the frustration that always seemed to radiate from him. "Any developments?" Maigret asked quietly. Whodunit didn't answer immediately. He shuffled through a few papers on his desk, then let out a small sigh. "Not much," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The usual suspects. Nothing new. Nothing that gives us a real lead." Maigret nodded, but the unease was growing inside him, a gnawing sensation that refused to be ignored. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the case itself. It was everything surrounding it, the name Henry Lemoyne, the strange feeling that someone had been lying even if they hadn't spoken a word. It was all coming to a head, but he couldn't yet see how the pieces fit together. "I need to see the victim's belongings again," Maigret said, turning toward the door. "There's something I missed, something small. I can feel it." Lognon nodded, though he looked skeptical. "I'll have it brought to your office," he muttered, obviously uninterested in the detective's hunches. He wasn't the only one. Many of Maigret's colleagues had learned to dismiss his methods as too slow, too contemplative, and yet they couldn't deny the results. If there was one thing Maigret knew, it was that people never revealed themselves immediately. It took time, patience, observation, and sometimes it took someone else's silence to break the facade. At the scene of the crime, Maigret found himself once again immersed in the room where the murder had taken place. It looked almost identical to how he'd left it. The neat, tidy arrangement of belongings, the lack of disorder. It was almost as though someone had carefully restored the room after the incident, an unsettling sense of normalcy that only deepened the mystery. He leaned over the table, looking at the few personal effects the man had left behind. Nothing out of the ordinary: papers, a few books, a worn coat hanging on the back of a chair. And yet, something about the simplicity of it all made Maigret uneasy. There was a deliberate order to it that seemed almost forced. Lognon entered behind him, his footsteps heavier than usual, but Maigret barely acknowledged him. His mind was racing, picking up on tiny details that most would overlook. The way a book had been placed, the corner of a letter that was slightly turned, the way the curtains had been drawn. Nothing screamed of a violent confrontation. In fact, if Maigret had walked into the room without knowing what had occurred, he might have assumed it was merely the home of a solitary man, lost in his own routine. But the silence between them, the weight of something unsaid, was what truly unsettled Maigret. It had been in the look of the neighbors, in their hesitation when they spoke about the man who had lived here. They all seemed to know something they weren't willing to say. There was a kind of guilt in their eyes, but it wasn't the guilt of a murderer. It was the guilt of someone who had witnessed something they couldn't quite explain. He stood up and motioned to the chair. "Lognon, take a look at this," he said, and Lognon obediently moved toward the desk. But Maigret was no longer interested in the details of the case, not for now. He was lost in the deeper questions, the ones that hung just beyond the reach of evidence. "Do you ever wonder," Maigret asked, almost to himself, "what drives people to such extremes?" Lognon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room as though it might provide some kind of answer. Finally, he muttered, "It's always about something simple, isn't it? Love, money, fear, always the same things." Maigret nodded slowly, but it wasn't a solution that satisfied him. He was looking for something else, something that lay beneath the surface of every human action. He was looking for a clue that wasn't written down, a whisper in the dark. Back at his office, Maigret found himself drifting back to the name Henry Lemoyne. It repeated in his mind, echoing with the rhythmic certainty of a secret just out of reach. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that somehow that name was the key to unlocking everything. As the day wore on, Maigret's patience remained unshaken. He had no intention of rushing forward into action. There was no hurry. The answers would come. He just had to wait, to watch, and to listen. The sun had long disappeared behind the clouds. When Maigret made his way back to his apartment that evening, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle, just enough to keep the streets slick and quiet, but not enough to offer a sense of relief from the persistent gloom that had enveloped the city. 4 days, Paris, for all its elegance, felt like an exhausted version of itself, its famous landmarks shrouded in mist, its streets coated in a kind of dullness that seemed to match his own mood. He entered his building and climbed the stairs slowly, the weight of the case still pressing heavily on him. Every step he took felt as though it were pulling him deeper into the murk of the mystery that had come to dominate his life in the past week. There was still no clarity, just the nagging sensation that something was terribly wrong, and it had to do with Henry Lemoine. But why? What had he missed? As he opened the door to his apartment, Maigret was greeted by the familiar warmth of his home. Louise was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner. The soft sound of her voice, so ordinary and unaffected, brought a brief comfort to his weary soul. He could hear the clatter of pots and the occasional sizzle of something in the pan. It was a rhythm he had grown to depend on. "How was your day?" Louise asked without looking up. "Quiet," Maigret replied, his voice heavy. He shed his coat and placed it on the hook by the door, his gaze drifting over the room. Louise, sensing his mood, didn't press for more details. She knew better. Instead, she served him a plate of food and handed it to him with a faint smile. They ate in silence, as they often did. But there was a tension in the air, a quiet, unspoken understanding that something was bothering him. It wasn't just the case. It was something deeper, something that had been gnawing at him since the moment he had walked into Henry Lemoine's apartment. After dinner, Maigret sat by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked street. Louise cleared the dishes and went to the other room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He wasn't thinking of the case so much as he was thinking of Henry Lemoine, or more accurately, the people round him. There was something about Lemoine's life that didn't fit. The man had been ordinary, but too ordinary, almost as if he had crafted a persona that concealed the truth. Maigret took a deep breath, letting the evening air fill his lungs, and finally, the answer began to crystallize in his mind. It wasn't about what Lemoine had done. It was about what he hadn't done, the gaps in his life, the things he had left unspoken, the secrets that seemed to surround him. He hadn't been a man of violence, but of isolation, of quiet desperation, of a kind of emotional retreat that led to something far more dangerous than anyone had expected. The next morning, Maigret made his way to the small cafe near the station, where he often spent his mornings before heading to the office. The rain had tapered off to a fine mist, but the chill in the air seemed to have settled into his bones. As he sipped his coffee, his eyes were drawn to a small group of men gathered at the table across the room. They were speaking in low voices, their conversations punctuated by the occasional laugh or murmured remark. It was easy to dismiss them as just another group of regulars, but Maigret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about them. He watched them closely, noting the way they seemed to speak in coded language, how their gestures appeared carefully measured, as if they were guarding some secret. He could tell that they weren't ordinary men, they were part of something else, something hidden beneath the surface of their lives. His attention was drawn to one of them in particular, a man whose face seemed familiar, though Maigret couldn't immediately place him. He was tall, with sharp features and a quiet intensity that contrasted with the others. Maigret observed the way the man's eyes flickered toward the door every few minutes, as though he were waiting for someone. It was subtle, but it didn't escape the inspector's trained eye. Maigret didn't move at first. He let the man's presence settle into his awareness, watching without being noticed. He knew that in time, the man would reveal himself. They always did. After some time, the man rose from his seat, paying for his coffee before slipping out the door. Maigret followed at a distance, making sure to keep his movements casual. He wasn't sure why, but he knew that this man, whoever he was important to the case. The streets were still wet from the morning rain, and the sound of Maigret's footsteps was softened by the damp pavement. The man led him down a series of winding streets, each more isolated than the last, until they reached a small, nondescript building. The man glanced round before entering, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Maigret waited for a moment. Before approaching the building, he didn't know what he expected to find inside, but the sense of unease had grown stronger, a tugging at the back of his mind that refused to let go. He stood for a moment outside the door, considering his next move. He had no reason to believe the man was involved in the murder, but the quiet tension in the cafe, the way he had acted, told Maigret that something important was going on just beyond the reach of normal observation. The man had seemed like a ghost, one whose presence wasn't meant to be noticed, and now he was alone in a building that, for all its mundane appearance, had become a point of interest. Maigret glanced up and down the street. There was no one around, no sign of anything unusual. With a sigh, he pressed his hand to the door. Feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers, he had to know what was inside. The door creaked open, and Maigret slipped inside, the dimness of the hallway greeting him with its familiar, oppressive stillness. He moved quietly down the narrow corridor, keeping to the shadows. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar. Through the crack, Maigret could see the man from the cafe, standing in front of a desk, his back to the door. Maigret didn't move. He watched as the man leaned over the desk, picking up a piece of paper and scanning it briefly before folding it and tucking it into his coat pocket. The action was deliberate, but it wasn't the paper that Maigret was interested in. It was the way the man moved, the way he paused just long enough for Maigret to feel the weight of his silence. Before Maigret could react, the man turned, walking toward the door. Maigret froze, holding his breath. It was too late to retreat. He stood still, waiting, until the man passed just inches from him. The man's eyes briefly flickered toward him. There was no surprise, no fear, just the faintest recognition. As if he had known all along that Maigret was there. The man didn't speak, but as he moved past, Maigret caught a glimpse of the name on the paper he had tucked away. It wasn't much a simple address, but it was enough to make the inspector's heart race. The next morning, Maigret stood in front of his small desk. The piece of paper he had seen the man from the café fold and hide still in his hand. The address written on it was simple enough: a street name, number, and an apartment. There was nothing flashy or remarkable about it. In fact, it could have belonged to anyone. Yet, as Maigret stared at the address, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the address itself that disturbed him, but the way the man had tucked it away as if it were some illicit thing. Something that wasn't meant to be seen, yet was conspicuously carried close to his chest. Maigret's office was dim, the curtains still drawn against the grey morning light. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, watching the smoke curl in the air. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps outside his door. It was Whodunit. Maigret could already hear the heavy shuffle of his steps, and the distinct way he knocked more of a thud than a polite tap. "Come in," Maigret called, his voice even. The door opened with a reluctant creak. Whodunit stepped inside, his face drawn and tired, as always. He had a way of moving that made it seem as though the weight of the world rested squarely on his shoulders, though Maigret knew it was more likely the weight of his own lack of understanding. "Anything new, Whodunit?" Maigret asked, without looking up from the address. Whodunit paused, glancing over Maigret's shoulder at the paper in his hand. There was a moment of hesitation before he spoke. "Not much, Chief. A few witnesses say Lemoyne was well liked, never had any real problems. But then again, they all say that about someone after they're dead. It's the living you need to watch." Maigret nodded slowly, letting the words settle in his mind. There was always a truth in Whodunit's ramblings, buried somewhere beneath the irritation. It was a truth Maigret had learned to recognize, even if it was often unpolished. "I've got an address," Maigret said quietly, lifting the paper in front of him. "I'm going to pay a visit. You stay on the Lemoyne case. I'll need a report when I get back." Whodunit gave a grunt of agreement and left, leaving Maigret alone with his thoughts once more. The address was located on the outskirts of the city, near the intersection of two quiet streets. It was a modest neighborhood, quiet enough that Maigret wondered how long it would take for anyone to notice that something was out of place. He took the train to the nearest station and then walked the rest of the way. The morning fog clung to the streets like a blanket, muffling the usual sounds of Paris. It felt almost too still, as though the city were holding its breath. Maigret arrived at the building around mid-morning, the drizzle having returned. The apartment building was old, the bricks worn and chipped in places, and the windows slightly fogged with the cold. He stood for a moment outside, observing it in silence, his mind working through the possibilities. Who lived here, and why had the man from the café hidden this address? Maigret had no answers, only more questions. He wasn't one to rush in blindly, though. He wasn't about to knock on the door and demand answers. That wasn't his way. Instead, he lingered by the building's entrance, watching the people who passed by, There were a few locals, a woman with a shopping bag, an older man in a suit. No one seemed to take notice of him. The rhythm of the neighborhood was slow, unhurried, like an old clock ticking steadily through time. Eventually, the door to the building opened and a young woman stepped out. She was in her mid-20s, dressed plainly, but with an air of quiet determination. Maigret didn't recognize her, but there was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that caught his attention. She didn't belong to the ordinary rhythm of the place. She was more purposeful. She walked past Maigret, barely giving him a second glance, and made her way down the street. Maigret waited a moment before deciding to follow her. He kept his distance, never letting her out of his sight, yet always allowing enough space to avoid drawing attention. The woman led him down a narrow alleyway and into a small, inconspicuous cafe at the end of the block. It was a place Maigret had never seen before, though it looked like it had been there for decades. The sign outside was faded, the windows streaked with rain, and inside, the low murmur of voices blended with the clink of cups and saucers. Maigret paused at the doorway. Looking inside, the woman had already seated herself at a small table by the window, and was now speaking quietly with the man from the cafe, the same one Maigret had followed earlier. He stood at the counter, his back to Maigret, but there was no mistaking the familiar posture, the same quiet intensity that had caught Maigret's eye before. Maigret's heart quickened slightly, but he remained still, observing the pair from across the room. They were too far away from Maigret to hear their words, but it was clear that the woman and the man shared a connection. There was an ease in their exchange, a kind of unspoken understanding that hinted at something more than a casual conversation. The man's hand slid across the table, brushing against hers, a small, deliberate touch, but one that Maigret didn't miss. He had seen that gesture before, in other places where secrets were kept and lives were quietly unraveling. Maigret stood for a moment longer, watching them with a quiet intensity. He didn't move, didn't make his presence known. There was no need to. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and he had all the time in the world to watch them. He didn't know who the woman was, or how she was connected to the man, but something told him that she knew more than she was letting on. Turning slowly, Maigret left the cafe and stepped back into the rain-soaked street. He had enough information for now. The man from the cafe, the woman, the address. He could feel the threads of the mystery beginning to weave together, but there was still much to learn, and the truth would reveal itself slowly. Like the damp streets of Paris after a storm, Maigret knew better than anyone that sometimes the answers didn't come quickly, but when they did, they always came with the weight of a quiet revelation. The rain fell steadily, a quiet rhythm that seemed to match Maigret's thoughts. The streets of Paris had become a muted blur as he made his way back to the precinct, his mind occupied with the small details that seemed so insignificant on their own, but were beginning to add up in a way that felt almost deliberate. Maigret had been to the cafe, where the man had met the woman. He had followed them both, carefully observing the mannerisms that had unfolded. But the most curious thing was the sense of inevitability that had surrounded the encounter. It wasn't just a meeting between two people, it was a turning point. A subtle shift that Maigret could almost feel in the air, as if this moment, this quiet exchange of words, was the culmination of something far more intricate. But he couldn't yet make sense of it. As Maigret entered the precinct, he was greeted by the usual disarray. Paperwork scattered across desks, phones ringing in the background, the low murmur of detectives talking over their cases. He was aware of Lognon's presence in the far corner, but he had no interest in discussing the case yet. There was something more pressing on his mind, a nagging question that refused to leave him alone. He walked through the precinct with the same calm, measured steps, heading directly for his office. Once inside, he let the door close behind him with a soft click. The silence of the room settled around him, and for a moment, Maigret closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the city. Beyond the walls. It was a sound he had become accustomed to, the sound of a city that never truly slept, yet never quite woke either. Maigret sat at his desk and pulled out the address again, staring at it for a long time. His mind wandered back to the woman he had seen with the man in the cafe. There had been something in her eyes that had caught his attention, a weariness, a quiet sadness, like she was waiting for something to happen, something she wasn't ready for. It was an expression Maigret knew all too well, the same look he had seen on the faces of countless others. Before the truth came crashing down on them, he reached for his pipe, but his hand paused mid-motion. Something wasn't right. In the midst of all the small details he had gathered, one piece of the puzzle still felt out of place: the man from the cafe. He wasn't just a figure of passing interest. There was something about him that Maigret couldn't quite grasp, something that slipped through his fingers whenever he tried to pin it down. The connection between him and the woman, was it purely emotional, or was there something more? And why had the man been so careful about hiding the address? Was he merely trying to keep his whereabouts from prying eyes, or was it a more calculated move? Maigret leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of his desk as he thought. He had worked with a great many suspects in his time, but this case, this particular puzzle, felt different. It was subtle, quiet, like a slow-moving river that could wash everything away without a sound. The sound of a knock at the door brought him out of his reverie. "Come in," he said without looking up. Lognon entered, carrying a file under his arm, his face slightly flushed from the effort of climbing the stairs. "Chief, I've got some news," Lognon said, setting the file down on Maigret's desk. "I spoke with some of Lemoyne's neighbors. They all confirmed that he didn't have many visitors. There were no strange noises, no signs of a struggle. Everything was normal." Maigret raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting Lognon continue. "The woman who found the body," Lognon continued, "she's been cleared. No connection to Lemoyne at all. She lives on the same street, but doesn't seem to have known him." "Are you sure?" Maigret asked, his voice low. Lognon nodded. "Absolutely. No one in the building knew him well, not even the landlord. No family, no close friends." Maigret felt a flicker of something discomfort. Perhaps the absence of a connection. It felt too neat, too clean. "Where's the body now?" Maigret asked. Still at the morgue. Lognon answered. They'll have a report for us soon. Maigret said nothing for a moment, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. I'll be going to the morgue, he said finally. Something doesn't add up here. The morgue was a cold place, as Maigret had always remembered it. The sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the earthiness of damp stone. The hum of fluorescent lights above adding to the sterile atmosphere. The coroner greeted him with a nod, his face drawn and tired, as though the weight of his profession had settled permanently on his shoulders. We've got the report on Lemoyne, the coroner said, gesturing to the body that lay on the cold slab. Nothing unusual, except the wound. Maigret stepped closer, examining the body. The man looked ordinary in death, his features slack and pale. The blood was dark and congealed, but there was a strange cleanliness to the scene. No struggle, no signs of violence beyond the wound itself. It's clean, Maigret murmured, almost to himself. To clean, exactly, the coroner replied, raising an eyebrow. It's like someone took care to make sure it looked like a natural death. The wound itself is small, but deep, almost surgical. Surgical? Maigret asked, his voice tight, not in the way you're thinking. More like a controlled, deliberate thing. A wound made with precision. Maigret stood for a moment, considering the coroner's words. There was something unsettling about the notion. It wasn't the kind of thing you expected in a murder case. No wild violence, no brutal attack, just precision. Who would do something like that? Maigret muttered under his breath. The coroner shrugged. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Maigret's gaze shifted back to the body, the stillness of it, the absence of struggle, the calculated nature of the wound. I want a full report. I'll be back tomorrow, Maigret said, turning toward the door. The coroner nodded, and Maigret left the morgue, stepping back into the grey streets. The city seemed quieter now, the rain continuing its relentless patter on the pavement. But for Maigret, the silence was no longer soothing. It was an omen, a warning. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong all along. The night had fallen heavier now, the rain relentless against the windows of Maigret's office. The light outside had long since faded, and the hum of the city seemed to slow as the evening grew deeper. Paris was different in the dark, quieter, but no less alive. Maigret sat at his desk, his hands resting on a pile of reports. But his mind was far away. He had returned to the scene once more, revisiting the street where Lemoyne had lived. It had been an ordinary building, unremarkable and quiet, yet there had been a distinct feeling in the air, a sense that the place was hiding something, a secret folded into the fabric of its existence, waiting for the right person to find. Maigret had walked around the block several times, his eyes scanning the windows, the doors, the forgotten corners. It was the kind of street where nothing happened, and yet everything could. It was exactly the kind of place where a crime like this could fester, unnoticed, until it was too late. His eyes moved over the reports once again. The woman at the cafe, the ones who had seen her leave with Lemoyne, was too simple, too clean. There was no mess, no confrontation. Nothing about this felt like a crime of passion or a desperate act. It was too cold, too calculated. Maigret sighed deeply, tapping his pipe against the edge of his desk. He hadn't been able to find anything out of place in Lemoyne's life, but it was in the absence of the obvious that Maigret found the subtle hints. This was no random murder. This was something else, and the more he delved into it, the more it felt like a story with more than one side. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he said, looking up. Lognon entered, carrying yet another folder. His face was tense. His eyes narrowed. Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Is it bad news?" he asked, his voice low. Lognon hesitated before speaking. "It's not the news we were hoping for. I spoke with some of the people who frequented the cafe where Lemoyne and the woman met. One of them, an older man, a regular, he overheard something strange." Maigret's interest piqued, and he leaned forward slightly. "Go on." "Apparently, the woman—" Lognon's voice trailed off. "She had been there before, and she wasn't a stranger to Lemoyne. But she wasn't just a visitor. She was familiar with him, more than a passing acquaintance." "Familiar how?" Maigret asked, his voice quiet but insistent, almost as though they had some past connection, something that went beyond a chance meeting. The man couldn't hear it all, but there was talk of a history between them. Maigret let the words settle for a moment. He had suspected there was more to the relationship than what had been obvious. But this, it was the kind of detail that changed everything. If this wasn't just a random meeting, if there was history involved, then it wasn't just as simple crime. It was personal. "Did anyone hear anything about why she was there?" Maigret asked. Lognon shook his head. "Not directly, but there's a rumor. Some of the locals believe she was involved with someone else, a man who might have known Lemoyne. A jealous lover, perhaps. But it's all speculation." "Speculation," Maigret repeated thoughtfully, staring at the floor. His fingers tapped gently on the desk again. "A jealous lover." It fit, in a way. Jealousy often led to violence, especially when mixed with past grievances. He took a long drag from his pipe before looking back at Lognon. "Who else did you speak with?" "There's a woman who cleans the building where Lemoyne lived. She says she saw the woman leave the apartment the night of the murder." Maigret felt a flicker of recognition. The woman who had seen her leave. The one who had told them nothing substantial. This small fact might have been nothing in another case, but here, in this tangled web, it could be everything. "When did she leave?" Maigret asked, his tone sharp. "Late, very late. And when she left, she was wearing a scarf, covering most of her face." Maigret stood up abruptly. "Where is the woman?" Lognon hesitated. "She hasn't been seen since the day of the murder." Maigret's expression darkened. "That's no coincidence." He turned toward the door, his mind already working. "We need to find her now." The rain had not stopped, and the streets seemed darker as Maigret stepped outside. He lit his pipe as he walked, his mind running over the new information. A jealous lover, a woman who had been there before. A quiet exit under the cover of night. Everything seemed to be pointing in a direction, but he still couldn't see the full picture. The cafe was still open, The lights dimmed, the smell of fresh coffee wafting out into the night air. Maigret entered, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. The older man was sitting at the counter, sipping his drink in silence. Maigret approached him slowly, his presence quiet but commanding. "Do you mind if I join you?" Maigret asked. The man looked up, startled, but nodded in agreement. Maigret took the seat next to him, lighting his pipe and taking a long drag. Before speaking, "I hear you overheard something interesting," Maigret said. The man nodded slowly. It was nothing, really, just a few words. But the woman, she was upset, very upset. She was arguing with him, but she was trying to hide it. It wasn't just about a drink, not about a conversation. It was something more. Maigret leaned in, his voice lowering. "What exactly did you hear?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "She said something about needing to take care of things, like a promise that couldn't be kept." "I don't know. I didn't hear much, but it sounded like something big was happening between them." "Something big," Maigret repeated, his gaze narrowing. "Did she say anything else?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I think that's all. But I could tell she was afraid." Afraid. The word echoed in Maigret's mind as he stood up and nodded at the man. "Thank you," he said quietly. He left the cafe with a sense of finality, the puzzle slowly taking shape in his mind. The woman was afraid of what, though? Fear often came before the truth, as Maigret knew well. And now, with each new detail, the case seemed to grow more intricate, more human. It wasn't just a murder, it was a story about broken promises, guilt, and a past that refused to stay buried. He had what he needed. Now, all that was left was for the woman to speak. The morning had come to Paris with an oppressive grayness that seemed to press against the windows, suffocating the city in its melancholy embrace. The air was thick, damp, and carried with it the scent of wet stone and forgotten promises. The cafes were quieter than usual, the streets muted under the heavy rain, and the city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for nothing at all. Maigret had been up early, his mind already on the task that had consumed him for the last several days. The pieces of the puzzle were almost in place, but there was one final piece he needed: the woman, the one who had come to the cafe, who had been seen leaving Lemoyne's apartment, who had a history with him, a history that no one seemed willing to discuss. He had no idea where she was now. No one did. The cleaner hadn't seen her again since the night of the murder, and there were no leads. It was as if she had disappeared into the fog of the city, blending into the shadows, unwilling to be found. Maigret sat in his office, the silence of the room wrapping around him like a blanket. The light from the desk lamp flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the papers in front of him. His eyes drifted to the rain running down the window pane, his mind a tangle of unanswered questions. What had happened between Lemoyne and the woman? Why had she left so quickly, so quietly? And why had she disappeared after the murder? The door to his office creaked open, and Maigret didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lognon stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with an unmistakable urgency. "We found her," Lognon said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maigret's heart skipped a beat, and he stood up immediately. Where? Lognon stepped inside and handed Maigret a folder. She's in a boarding house, just off the Rue de la Vieille-Lanterne. She's been staying there for the last week, under a different name. Maigret took the folder, his fingers running over the details. The woman had been using the name Claire Dubois, a common enough name. But it was the address that mattered. It was near the heart of the city, a place where people came and went, where the ordinary and the extraordinary mixed without anyone noticing. Maigret didn't waste another moment. He grabbed his coat, threw it on, and headed for the door. Lognon followed him, his steps quick but heavy, as though the weight of the case was bearing down on him. They arrived at the boarding house just as the rain seemed to intensify. The building was old, its stone exterior chipped and weathered by years of neglect. The windows were small and grimy, the entrance tucked away in a narrow alley that seemed to lead nowhere. It was the kind of place where secrets could be kept, without anyone asking questions. Maigret knocked softly on the door of the boarding house, his hand steadied despite the rising tension in his chest. It was a quiet knock, not urgent, just a polite request for entry. The door opened slowly, and a woman in her mid-40s stood in the doorway, her face tired and drawn, as though she hadn't seen a good night's sleep in weeks. Yes, she asked, her voice cautious. We're looking for Claire Dubois, Maigret said, his tone calm but firm. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, and she stepped back slightly, as though uncertain of how to respond. She's upstairs. She hasn't been feeling well. I don't think she'll want to speak to anyone. Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable. We're not here to disturb her. We just need to speak with her. The woman hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the boarding house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and stale cigarettes. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they followed the woman up the narrow staircase. At the top of the stairs, she gestured to a door at the end of the hall. Second door on the left. She said quietly, "She's in there." Maigret nodded again, his mind already working through the possibilities. They reached the door, and Maigret knocked gently, his hand poised but steady. "Claire Dubois?" he called softly. "We need to speak with you." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Maigret wondered if she had heard him. But then, from inside the room, there was the sound of shuffling, and the door creaked open a few inches. A pair of eyes peered out at them, wary and suspicious. "Yes?" the woman asked. Her voice strained. Maigret took a step back, giving her space. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. This is Inspector Lognon. We're investigating the death of a man named Lemoyne. We believe you knew him." The woman's face paled at the mention of the name, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, with a resigned sigh, she opened the door wider, allowing them to step inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A single bed with a rumpled blanket, a wooden chair pushed against a small table, and a wardrobe in the corner. The walls were bare, the only decoration a faded photograph of a child hanging above the bed. The woman looked older now, her face gaunt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She was dressed in a loose, faded nightgown, and her hair was unkempt, falling in uneven strands around her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want anyone to find out." Maigret stepped closer, his gaze softening. "It's all right. We're not here to judge you. We just need to understand." She closed her eyes, a tremor passing through her body as she sat down on the edge of the bed. "I didn't want him to die, but I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to fix everything." Longnon glanced at Maigret, sensing the shift in the room. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice quiet. The woman took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Lemoyne. He wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't who he pretended to be. He had a secret, a big one. And when I found out, I thought it would ruin everything. I thought if I confronted him, it would all be over. But he didn't want to listen. He didn't care. And then she broke off, tears filling her eyes. The room grew still, and for a long moment, Maigret said nothing. He didn't need to ask the next question. He already knew. "Why did you leave?" he finally asked. "Why did you leave before anyone could see you?" The woman's gaze dropped to her hands, trembling in her lap. "Because I was afraid of what he might do, afraid of what I might do. I couldn't stay, not after what I learned, not after what he did." The truth was coming slowly, like water from a well that had long since run dry. But Maigret knew now. It wasn't about jealousy, or revenge, or even murder for its own sake. It was about fear, fear of betrayal, of discovery, and of a past that couldn't be undone. "Do you know who killed him?" Maigret asked gently. The woman's eyes met his, and for a moment they were filled with understanding. "I didn't do it, but I know who did." Her voice cracked, and for the first time since Maigret had entered the room, he saw the rawness of her fear, the depth of her guilt. She wasn't the killer, but she had been the catalyst, the one who had set everything in motion. And now, all Maigret had to do was let her speak the rest of the truth. Maigret remained still, watching Claire Dubois as she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted tightly in her lap. She had given him enough to start piecing things together, but the truth still remained tangled, elusive. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear, regret, and something darker, something Maigret had learned to read as guilt. She had revealed a fragment of the truth, but not all of it, not yet. "You said you know who killed him," Maigret repeated softly, his voice calm and reassuring. The same tone he had used hundreds of times in similar moments. His presence was not meant to intimidate, but to encourage the reluctant to speak their truth. Claire's breath hitched, and for a long moment she said nothing. Maigret let the silence stretch, his eyes never leaving hers. Sometimes it was in the quietest of moments that the smallest details would slip out. He didn't need a confession, he needed understanding. "I didn't want it to happen," Claire finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted him dead. But it was already too late." Maigret nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. She was reluctant, But he had learned long ago that patience was often more effective than any sharp question. I met him 3 years ago, in a cafe by the river, Claire said, her voice hollow, as if the words were dredged from a place long buried. He was kind to me at first, so kind, but I never knew what he really did, what he was really like. He made me feel safe. He promised me everything. I thought I had found someone to protect me. Maigret let her speak. His thoughts wandered briefly to Lemoyne, the man she had been involved with. So far, he had painted a picture of a man who had not been what he appeared, someone who had hidden his true self behind layers of charm and manipulation. But there was more to it, something deeper than just deceit. But then I started to see things, Claire continued, her voice breaking. Small things at first, nothing that seemed important. But then it all started to come together. I found out that Lemoyne, he wasn't who he said he was. He was involved in something darker, something dangerous. I don't know how it started, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. She paused, and Maigret took a slow step toward her, lowering his voice even more. What did you find out? Her eyes darted to the window, as though the city outside might offer an escape from the conversation. He was involved in smuggling illegal goods, people, you name it. I didn't know the details, not at first, but then, one night, I saw a man come to his apartment, a man with a briefcase, and they were talking in whispers. I saw their faces, and I could tell they were arguing about something, but I didn't understand what. I only knew that it wasn't good. Maigret nodded thoughtfully. This new information began to shape a clearer image of Lemoyne. But the picture was still incomplete. It wasn't just a lover's quarrel or a dispute over money. This was something larger, darker, and more complex. Lemoyne had been tangled in a world of shadows, and Claire had been caught in its web. I confronted him about it, Claire said, her voice suddenly colder, more detached. I had to know. I had to understand. But he denied it. He told me I was imagining things. He said I didn't understand the dangers of the world he was in. But I knew enough, and that's when it started. He started to change. He became more distant, more unpredictable. I was scared of him, and I didn't know what to do. Maigret could feel the weight of her words, the quiet desperation that had been building in her as she recounted her growing fear. She hadn't just been in love with Lemoyne, she had been afraid of him too. Fear of his darker side, fear of the world he was part of, and fear of what might happen if she tried to escape it. I should have left him, Claire whispered, almost to herself. I should have run away, but I was trapped. I didn't know how to get out. What happened the night of the murder? Maigret asked gently. Claire's hands twisted again in her lap, her eyes lowering to the floor. I don't know exactly. I went to his apartment that night. He asked me to come. He said he wanted to talk. But when I got there, he was already with someone, a man I'd never seen before. Did you recognize him? Maigret asked, watching her carefully. She shook her head slowly. No, I don't think I ever saw him before. But they were speaking in low voices. I heard Lemoyne say something about how he couldn't keep running. And the man told him that it was too late. that there was no way out. I thought maybe they were talking about the things Lemoyne had done. I thought maybe it was some kind of threat. Maigret's mind began to work quickly. This new information added a new layer to the mystery. Lemoyne hadn't been killed by a crime of passion. This was something calculated, something connected to his dark dealings. The mysterious man, whoever he was, had a hand in this. And then Maigret prodded. "I didn't stay," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I left. I didn't want to be a part of whatever was happening between them. I thought if I just walked away, it would all be over. But when I left, Lemoyne followed me. He was angry. He shouted at me in the street. He said I was abandoning him, that I was just like everyone else." Maigret felt the tension rising in the room as Claire's voice wavered. This was the moment that had tipped the balance, the moment that had led to the murder. It wasn't just about smuggling, or betrayal, or love. It was a culmination of Lemoyne's secrets, his fears, and the web he had woven around himself. "And that's when you left the apartment?" Maigret asked. Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, I thought I had escaped. But then, the next morning, I heard about his death, and I knew that whatever happened that night, whatever argument they had, it had ended with him dead." She paused, the silence hanging heavily in the room. Maigret could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she blamed herself for what had happened. But the truth was clear now. She hadn't killed Lemoyne. She had only been caught in a situation that she didn't understand, a situation that had spiraled out of control. "You didn't kill him," Maigret said quietly. "But you know who did." Claire's eyes widened, and she looked away, as though afraid of confirming the truth. But Maigret could see the fear in her face, the guilt that had been gnawing at her since the night of the murder. I don't know if I should say," she whispered. Maigret stood quietly, his presence a calm anchor in the storm of her emotions. "You must, for your sake, and for his." The silence stretched between them, and then Claire finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "It was the man with the briefcase, the one I saw with Lemoyne. He was the one who killed him." Maigret nodded, the pieces falling into place. The truth had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. The murder had not been random, it had been part of a larger game, a consequence of the dangerous world Lemoyne had chosen to inhabit. But now, the last thread had been pulled. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. As Maigret stood in the small, dimly lit room, the rain continued to fall outside, its rhythmic sound a reminder of the quiet resolution that had come with the passing of time. The case was far from over, but now, at last, he knew where to look. Next, the heavy Parisian rain was still falling as Maigret stepped away from Claire's apartment. The damp streets stretched before him, the lights from the nearby cafes reflecting on the wet cobblestones. The city seemed quieter now, as if the storm had softened its edges. Maigret's coat, though heavy with moisture, offered little comfort against the chill in the air, but he didn't mind. He was used to it. It was part of the fabric of his work, this constant exposure to the elements, to the discomfort that came with trying to understand the depths of human nature. And it was precisely the discomfort that had led him to the truth tonight. He could already feel the weight of the case lifting, though it was not a full resolution. Claire had not killed Lemoyne. No, that truth had been with him all along, hidden behind the shadows of his own suspicions. She had been a pawn in a much darker game, entangled in something that had long since spiraled beyond her control. The man with the briefcase, the one who had appeared with Lemoyne that fateful night, was the key. He wasn't just a figure passing through the story. He was the catalyst, the force that had driven everything to this moment. This man had orchestrated the death, using Lemoyne's own tangled life as a pawn. And Claire, as helpless as she had been, had become another piece on that board. Maigret's steps slowed as he reached the corner of the street. He paused, taking in the quiet sounds of the city around him, allowing himself a brief moment to reflect. There was no rush to return to the office, no need to hurry back to the precinct. Everything could wait. He thought of the many cases he had worked over the years, each one different in its own way, but ultimately the same. People, ordinary people who had been drawn into circumstances beyond their understanding, who had made choices, sometimes small, sometimes life-altering, that had led to unspeakable acts. There was always a point in every case where the truth was revealed, not through the evidence, but through the people themselves. A pause in the conversation, a shift in their body language, a fleeting look in their eyes. It was in those moments, in the spaces between words, that Maigret truly found his answers. This case, like so many others, had unfolded not in the brilliance of a single revelation, but in the slow, deliberate movement of human emotions. It had been Claire's hesitation, her unspoken fears, her guilt, that had pointed him in the right direction. And once he had recognized that, everything else had fallen into place. The quiet moments of her confession, the soft voice that trembled with shame, had told Maigret everything he needed to know. Maigret knew what he had to do next. The man with the briefcase would be his next target, the key to unraveling the final threads of this case. But there would be no dramatics, no grand confrontation. He had learned long ago that the truth didn't need to be shouted. It was in the quiet conversations, in the patience of waiting for the right moment, that the deepest truths were revealed. His thoughts turned to the people involved, the ones whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. Lemoyne, for all his faults, had been a man who had lived in shadows. Someone who had never really understood the weight of his actions until it was too late. And Claire, caught in the crossfire, had been just as much a victim as anyone else. She had wanted nothing more than to escape, but she had been drawn back, time and time again, by the man who had held her in his grasp. And now the case was almost finished. It wasn't a victory, not in the way that others might have seen it. There were no grand celebrations, no heroic moments, just a quiet sense of closure. Because in the end, it wasn't the crime that mattered, but the people caught in its web. Maigret lit a cigarette, the smoke swirling around him as he exhaled. Slowly, watching the smoke dissipate into the air, the streetlights flickered in the distance, their glow casting a soft light on the wet pavement. He was tired, as he always was after a case, tired but satisfied in a way. He didn't need the recognition, didn't need the accolades that others sought. His satisfaction came from knowing that, in the end, he had uncovered the truth. It wasn't always a neat, clean answer, but it was the answer that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The rain continued to fall as Maigret made his way down the street. His pace was steady, unhurried. He had time. It was one of the rare luxuries in his work time to reflect, to let the case settle in his mind, to understand the layers of human complexity that lay beneath the surface of the investigation. As he turned the corner and saw the familiar silhouette of his apartment building in the distance, Maigret felt a small flicker of contentment. Tomorrow, the final pieces of the case would be put into place. The man with the briefcase would be found, and justice would be served. But for now, Maigret allowed himself a moment of quiet. He had earned it. In the end, he knew that the truth wasn't always a matter of evidence or quick answers. It was about understanding the human heart, the fears, the desires, the regrets that led people down paths they never intended to walk. The answers were always there, hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting to be uncovered by someone who was willing to listen. As Maigret walked into his apartment, the door creaking softly behind him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for his work. He didn't need grand gestures, loud victories. He had found his peace in the silence, in the quiet moments of understanding. The case was over, and the rain continued to fall outside, its steady rhythm a reminder of the constant flow of life, ever moving, ever changing, and ever seeking the truth. And with that, Maigret closed the door behind him, leaving the night to continue without him. It had been another long day, and in the quiet of his apartment, with the soft hum of the city beyond, he allowed himself to simply be. The case was done. Tomorrow would bring another. But for now, he was content.